juice behind the mush that is edible. We use it to get the water of cassava or yucca out of that ground vegetable, because sometimes if it's bitter cassava, the juice has arsenic. It can kill you. If you extract the juice, you are able to eat what is left behind. Ancestral call that requires me to speak truth when I give my Panui. Ko Roraima te maunga, ko Demerara te aua, ko Mackenzie te kainga, ko Edmund LaRocque Williams, taku papa no Guyana, no ko Clarine Pinda tuku mama no Panama, ko Keith Williams taku parata no ho ana ia kei Seattle, ko Waiau, ko Mona Williams tuku ingoa. He ki rira rao o Aotearoa. I tahi tia oku te puna mai i Afrika neke atu e te rua rao tau ki muri ki Guyana. He uri au o ngā morihu whakapongonga, ngā tipuna whakahi. No Guyana au, ko Guyana taku papakainga. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Shalom. Thanks to all of you for coming. And to read New Zealand, Te Pou Muramura, our host. My sincere thanks to their excellencies, scholars, authors, poets, illustrators, storytellers, teachers, and administrators in the audience, and to the chair of the board. Thank you to the staff and students of Whitireia, and to my family and all of my friends. I begin with my karakia, a Hebrew prayer forged with the history of my Guyana culture. It is a Hebrew blessing for this particular moment, having been kept safely by Adashem. It is the Shehikianu, and of course, because we are not in the synagogue, we wouldn't say Adonai, but we will say Adashem. Everyone who knows it, join me. Baruch atah Adonai Adashem Eloheinu melech haolam shehikianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lahazman hazeh. My mountain is Roraima in the Guyana highlands of the Amazon. Hello, Maryland. My river is the Demerara, which has a devastating history of French, Dutch, and British slave plantations that produced sugar, rum, and tobacco over hundreds of years. My county, also called Demerara, witnessed slave rebellions that resulted in enslaved people being massacred in their hundreds by the British, according to British Guyana's colonial records. These rebellions are remembered among my black compatriots. 2023 commemorates the 200th anniversary of the most infamous of these, when more than 1,000 enslaved people were slaughtered in Demerara's biggest slave rebellion. This August, the nation received an apology in person from a descendant of the Gladstone family, on whose plantation the uprising took place. And for those of you who know British history, Gladstone was the Prime Minister, many times, of the British Parliament during the reign of Queen Victoria. My nation is the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, formerly British Guiana, hence why I refer to it in both forms, British Guiana, and when we became independent, Guyana. It is within the Commonwealth and situated on South America's northern shore. My family's name is Williams, not an African name. It attests to the historical fact that African slaves sold to slave owners were branded and then assigned the name of their plantation owners. And they were branded not with an iron brand. That'll take too long to heal. A silver one was used, so you can get on with the work quickly. My ancestors were owned by Welsh members of Britain's plantocracy, the Williams family. My mother married my father, Edmund Williams, and bore him 3 children. They separated when I was 2, when my father immigrated to England to help rebuild the mother country after World War II. My dad lies buried in Guyana. My mother's family has lived in both the Caribbean and Guyana. My foremothers have been small business owners in every generation. My great-great-grandmother, Sarah Allen, a fishmonger from Barbados, emigrated to Guyana in 1880, all on her own, no husband, but she had 3 children with her. She was numerate, she could count, but illiterate. It had been illegal to teach black people to read or write. Yet, Sarah Allen built and owned her own home by selling fish shrewdly for 40 years. So, Sarah Allen, and then her daughter, my great-grandmother, my beloved Adriana. Adriana Connell was literate, a successful laundress and a skilled bush midwife. If any of the mothers or babies she attended had died, Adriana could have been jailed for life. More defiantly, Adriana was a secret farmer in our Amazon jungle. She refused, she avoided paying the colonial government a land tax for sly farming on crown land to feed our family. Sarah Allen and Adriana Connell lie buried in Demerara County, Guyana. So now, Sarah, the fishmonger, Adriana, the sly farmer on crown land. Now, Adriana Connell's eldest child was my grandmother, Rose Titus. Rose prized her standard 6 education. She owned and ran a thriving bakery business importing wheat flour from Canada, from Manitoba. When I was 10, I realized that Rose owned a 2-storied house, 5 rental properties, a 1/4 mile of land, and what a back garden. It had 2 avocado trees, mango and papaya trees, about 30 coconut palms scattered right through, a banana sucker, taro plants, chickens, and vines. Before selling up, my grandmother was a community leader. Her husband, Caesar Collingwood Nelson, my step-grandfather, was the highly respected chief pharmacist of Mackenzie Hospital, because in those days, black men were just people who worked with their hands. They were laborers. My granddad was a pharmacist. He was educated. So now we go back. Sarah, the fishmonger, was followed by Adriana, the laundress, and the sly farmer and the bush midwife, followed by Rose, who was the baker, and now my mum. My mum, Clarine Pinder, was Rose's only child. Rose bore mum to a Panamanian merchant marine. They separated when mum was a little over a year. He was, you know, the sailor has a wife in every port, and he was a guy who couldn't say no. So my grandmother thought better to let it go, so that was the only child she had. My mum, Clarine, was brought up as a rich, spoilt only child. Mum became a primary school teacher working with deaf children and children with disabilities, and she did that for 20 years. In 1967, Mum won a Fulbright scholarship to study in America and a Commonwealth scholarship to study in England. She accepted both. After experiencing these wealthier worlds, Mum chose to emigrate to America in the 1980s and trained first as a pediatric nurse, then switched to geriatric nursing, her final career. My grandmother Rose, the baker, my mum Clarine, the nurse, and my only sister Claire, a nursing administrator, all immigrated to America and are buried in Washington, D.C. I have two brothers. Walter Robert Williams, my older brother, was indeed my brother by another mother. He lived in Britain and was given the honor of being a member of the Royal Society, an honor awarded to Sir Edmund Hillary and Dr. David Livingstone, and he always boasted and said, Hillary got one, Livingstone got one. They didn't give it to Darwin, but they gave it to me. Now that is a whole other story. Bob's pride rested in having built Saudi Arabia's 4th airfield, a military airfield. He died early this year in April in Herefordshire in England. So now we get to my mother and her children. My mother's eldest child was my sister Claire Williams Cummings. Claire immigrated to America in the 1970s, gained her nursing degree, married but had no children, and Claire is buried in D.C. and shares a grave with Mum. I am the second born, and my little brother Keith Williams was the family's pride and joy as the only male member resident in this female-ruled family. Keith immigrated to America in 1967. After graduating from university, he has worked disbursing federal funds to social welfare offices in Western Washington State and Alaska. Keith lives with his family near Seattle. Now that's your Uncle Keith. Okay, kids? Good. Finally, I am Mona Williams, a very proud descendant of slavery survivors and a 5th-generation South American, hence my headdress. This is an imitation of Wapatian headdress of the Native Americans of the South American region in where I am, in the Amazon region. I am a mother of 2 daughters over there, and nana of 7 Mokopuna. In my early 20s in Guyana, I won a Fulbright Hayes Scholarship, and at university, a Rockefeller Foundation Scholarship. I graduated from Stanford University in California in 1970 and proceeded to work at and perform as a storyteller in San Francisco on KQED TV Channel 9. At Stanford University, I met and married a fellow foreign student, a Kiwi, then emigrated to New Zealand in 1971. My marriage lasted 9 years. Since my arrival, I have been at different times a primary and secondary school teacher, a writer, storyteller, a teacher of Caribbean dance, a Massey University lecturer for 16 years, a singer of Hebrew liturgy in my synagogue, and Rabbi, I am still learning to pronounce the words correctly. All right? I am a Jewish feminist, a citizen, and an international educator. I'm also the recipient of a rare personal apology from the New Zealand government, atoning for 51 years of destructive racist treatment, but that's another story. Now, to read, to tell stories, is to think. That is, to attempt to make sense of our world. Do you know that you are all storytellers? Well, that's a remark that prompts disbelief. Some are story writers, but every nation tells stories. From the beginning of time, humans have attempted to give structure and coherence to our jumbled life experiences by telling stories. Myths explain phenomena beyond our ken. So it is Persephone and her story of going as the bride to the god of the underworld that tells us how autumn and winter happen, and when she returns to her mother, that's when spring and summer come around. And those are the legends and the myths of Greece and the world. And that's how we know about the seasons. Isn't that true? So, folk tales enlighten us with the profound wisdom of seemingly simple folk. Selected details help us to decide who we are, who others are, what is right for us, what is unethical, what are cherished insights, who our heroes are, who were destructive to our ancestors, and what sort of person we should strive to be. Damus petimus que vicissim. We give and receive in turn. That was the motto of my nation, in the nation in which I was born, the former British Guiana. The British colonial rulers presented trade as a fair give and take. In contrast, I saw how this former slave colony had imported African people as chattels, and over the centuries exported volumes of sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum. In the 20th century, they also ripped out and shipped out bauxite, timber, gold, and rice. Yet our nation remains poor. We received a pittance for the resources exported and bought British manufactured goods at inflated prices, thus plundering the money we had earned. Indeed, in deals to satisfy Britain's trade arrangements, we imported ridiculous goods like Norwegian salted codfish. Despite Guyana bordering the abundant Caribbean Sea teeming with fish, I regard nothing received from Britain as a gift. Our education system, roads, hospitals, civil service, and ports existed to facilitate Britain's colonial exploitation. However, who could have foreseen that living in Aotearoa, I would support the work of the New Zealand Book Council, its name in former years, by promoting reading, writing, and storytelling in schools and communities for decades. How could I have known that in so doing, I would be healed of the brutalization endured as a black citizen in a white-ruled colony of my birth? Welcomed as a writer in schools, I was accorded dignity and respect from audiences even before I began storytelling performances or readings. Such was the prestige attached to visiting schools under the auspices of the Book Council, the name for Read, New Zealand. I offered and received from audiences the deepest acknowledgement of our common humanity. Mind you, Guyanese life differed so spectacularly from my high school texts like "The Wind in the Willows." I accepted that I would understand only some of the story. I sometimes explained to school children that I found it impossible to understand Pakeha thinking or ways of life only by reading about it. Living as a Kiwi, that is, knitting cardigans, eating roasted mutton, not lamb, mutton, bringing a plate to a party, singing Tarmanui, Tarmanui, Tarmanui on the main trunk line, meeting Hirini Melbourne, Viti Ihimira and Joy Cowley, and walking the Milford track. These were the key. In order for you to appreciate the influence and patronage of Read New Zealand Te Pau Muramura on my life, allow me to share my experiences of becoming a writer and subsequently entering schools as a storyteller and a writer in schools. Children often ask, "Mrs. Williams, how did you become a writer in New Zealand?" An editor of the school journals, the late Jane Thompson, was an acquaintance. I confided to her that I had written a letter to my white mother-in-law sharing how differently Guyanese people celebrate Christmas, having experienced Christmas in San Francisco, Guyana, and now in New Zealand. My mother-in-law had been particularly hostile about the marriage of her son, the golden boy, to me, a black woman. I had hoped to correspond with her on any subject that was pleasant in order to build a positive relationship. Her outraged response to my letter disclosed a misunderstanding. She had interpreted it as putting down New Zealand traditions. She had ascribed to it a hidden agenda. Deeply distressed, I asked Jane to read a carbon copy of the letter I had sent. Fascinated by the details and finding nothing disrespectful, Jane praised the letter. In her role as an editor, she suggested that I rewrite it as an article. Then she accepted and submitted the text to the school journal. I felt impelled to write more stories. From 1972, I poured out autobiographical stories and Guyanese folk tales. Jane advised me to send to Guyana for pictures and other details to improve my writing. I rewrote stories many times, which were published in the journals. The pride I felt from being read by Kiwi school children, that overwhelmed me. "Do you copy how other people write?" children asked. "Oh, just the way that you read a story and afterwards begin to write. I, too, have learned to write that way." I suggest encouragingly to anyone, every time they ask about writing and reading. Even from the age of 8, I said, I constructed sentences that mimicked a book I had just read. I longed to begin a story with an historical date after reading Charles Kingsley's novel, Westward Ho! His novel told the adventures of buccaneers in the Caribbean during the Elizabethan age. I began my composition. "It was in the year 1880, when I sailed in a sloop from Barbados in the West Indies to British Guiana in South America. I took only my 3 children, 5-shilling coins hidden in my shoes, and my sharp brain of a fish seller." In fact, I had not made up any of that introduction. My great-great-grandmother, Sarah Allen of Barbados, had sailed from the Caribbean to British Guiana in 1880 on a sloop and had no more than a few shillings. But possessed the business skills of a fine fishmonger. My family's story incensed my headmaster. In the mid-1950s, I was attending his small one-room country school, and he was training me to sit a national scholarship exam. He hated cheating. He bellowed at me, "You've copied!" Well, I had, and I hadn't. I felt utterly ashamed in front of all of those children in the one-room school. This discouraged me from writing until well into high school, but I told myself stories I should have written. Both artistic disciplines blossomed in my 30s when I began to visit New Zealand schools to read my journal stories and was encouraged to tell them to. I urged children to read voraciously and to copy styles and literary devices that enthralled them. They inquired, "Mrs. Williams, did you find it hard to be a writer?" "Yeah. Making time was difficult, as I was raising children, but it was not difficult to write about childhood memories. The pay was minuscule, $14 per 1,000 words in the 1970s, but the satisfaction of having my stories read in New Zealand schools, that was immense. Children responded wholeheartedly to my own hilarious tales of stealing jam, which turned out to be burning chili pepper sauce, or risking my life by swimming across a wide river with a bauxite ore tanker sailing straight towards me. Seeing themselves in my stories, children realized that they too had similar stories to share orally or to write about. They realized that they are writers, should they wish to be. Another frequent question was, "Mrs. Williams, are your stories true?" My writing and telling reflected the difficulties of my childhood. Readers in the 1970s and 80s were usually incredulous and aghast that my being caned savagely in school, on my back, caning, for misspelling a word, wool, that was absolutely true. It heartened me to see them reject corporal punishment in schools, even before the New Zealand government passed that law. On the other hand, they could be diffident when considering the ethics of punishing a child. For instance, when I was about 6, I embarrassed my mum. Mum had told a white lie. I had spoken up and told the truth, but that shamed her. I knew I was in for a whipping. Surprisingly, a school journal editor in the 1970s, Brian Birchall, confided that he had faced strenuous opposition to printing my story titled, "You really saw my father?" It explored a child's conflict, mine, in wishing to know more about her estranged father in England without antagonizing her mother, the abandoned parent in Guyana. My story, it appears, was the first to reflect a broken home, a taboo subject in the school journals and New Zealand society at that time. Children avoided discussing living with a solo mum for fear of losing status. I often seized the opportunity to address the topic obliquely. Stories of war heroes, like the tunnelers at Arras in World War I. Actually, I went there and they call it Arras. The French don't pronounce the last letter in a word. Arras. And Charlie Upham, who escaped twice as a prisoner of war. Oh, they loved those stories. It enthralled the audience. I would mention that, well, sadly, Some soldiers fell in foreign lands. Their wives became war widows on a pension, and those women held their families together and raised the children. So while appreciating the sacrifice of our foreign Anzacs, we also admired the fortitude of their capable wives. In many of our nation's homes, and it is estimated in a quarter of all New Zealand homes, the heads of households were single or solo mums because of the many wars from 1860 to 1945. Despite this history, modern separated or divorced mums in the 70s and 80s, like myself, were despised as feminists, liberation, women's lib. Children from single-parent homes, irrespective of the reason, felt affirmed after hearing the blood and thunder of the Gallipoli and El Alamein stories, when they realized that war widows had equally admirable stories, but no one was telling them. I reassured children confidentially when on playground duty as a teacher. Years later, as adults, some listeners mentioned that they had felt less ashamed after reading my memory of my parents' separation. I had used the school journal to assist children to define their identity a decade before embarking on the Book Council's school visits. A perennial question is, Mrs. Williams, how can I write the story to make it more interesting? Well, begin by writing about what you know. Add what you see, what you hear, and what you think. That would lead to telling my story, The Bicycle, where a pivotal detail is withheld until the final surprising sentence, that sting in the tail technique. Such an ending disrupts the understanding of the story and forces the reader to reassess the narrative from the very beginning. We would read excerpts of Tessa Duda's Alex, paying attention to the details of Alex's interior turmoil and her insight into championship swimming, or Joy Cowley's Bow Down, Shadrach, to pinpoint the hilarious details which delineated every character. Children were encouraged to begin with autobiographical tales because, I assured them, these narratives require mainly the ability to remember what had happened to them. Audiences appeared astounded that they possessed an archive of autobiographical tales here, more numerous than all the books they would ever read. So I would begin with questions, and now I'll ask you to respond to the questions I would pose to the children. You don't have to say it, you just have to, do you have a hospital story? Was it to farewell Grandpa? Was it to see the new baby? Were you hurt? Were you ill? Were you crying because you had broken your arm? And how about a pet story? What did you like best about your pet? Remember your journey story? Did you travel by train, or was it by bus? Was it by air? Was it by a car? Was it on a bike? Was it on foot? Who or what did you see? Have you ever met a sports star, a rugby great? Well, I have met Umanga. And my daughter says, "Oh, Mom, that is so tacky." Have you been blamed for something you hadn't even done? Is there a water story about when you almost drowned? Can you remember a birthday you enjoyed? How did it feel going to the murder house? And for those of you who are not Kiwis, the murder house is the school dental nurse, and they did call it the murder house. Have you enjoyed spending pocket money? Well, if you wanted to embellish your story with details, it could become realistic fiction with a few additions, like the realistic stories in the school journal or See Ya Simon by David Hill? Was the day warm, summery, sunny, or was it blustery, fogged in, or freezing winter rainy like Wellington? What were Mum's exact words when she was angry with you? What were you wearing from head right down to your toes? Were you frightened and hungry? Were you exhausted and thirsty? Or were you excited but bursting for a pee? Teachers later sent me notes to recount how children read, told, and wrote avidly, comparing their stories with other stories they discovered in the journals. That Norse saga, Mrs. Williams, is it a true story? A girl asked. Well, could Elfwin's saga be true? I countered. Could a blind girl have saved her entire clan who all had perfect eyesight? Do the people in folk tales behave like people you know? Are some people kind while others are cruel? Are some folks hard-working while others wish riches by magic, or the Melbourne Cup, or the lotto? Are some traders wise and others foolish? Are some rulers greedy while others are generous? Stories tell truths about the ways in which humans behave, even when the stories are folk or fairy tales. You can decide if there are any truths in that saga, Elfwin's saga. Stories are an inoculation for listeners. Young people can experience the anxiety, the treachery, the cruelty, and the tragedy of Cinderella, but they could do it safely, surrounded by friends and teachers, confident that lessons can be learned safely, if not always happily. Children, steeped in myths, legends, folk tales, fables, and family history, can then face adult life with greater confidence, hope, and insight, instead of with perpetual terror. Mrs. Williams, can you tell us a story out of your own mouth? That child's request proved transformative. Oral literature in performance became my preferred medium. And I know if you're literate, you're going to say there cannot be oral literature. Literature is always what is written down. Well, Stanford had this huge program that I took, and it was called Oral Literature in Performance rather than storytelling. Good. In about 1976, I independently visited Wellington primary schools to read my journal stories. Well, children's responses to my reading were, yeah, right. The instant I switched to dramatic storytelling of the written version, their engagement sparked into electrified participation. My relating the trickster tale of a Kiwi farm boy on a remote sheep station stealing Christmas chocolates. Well, it encouraged the class to recount exploits of their stealing sweets, cake, soft drinks, and ice cream. In addition, my tale of a foolhardy swim across our wide Demerara River, or of almost being bitten by a well-camouflaged venomous snake, these hit the mark. Children fell over themselves, relating the moments when they were nearly bowled over by speeding cars at a road crossing. And they empathized with my anguish when I threw a tantrum at feeling like the outsider in my family. Well, many shared their outrage. Yeah, and you know, Lachi is Mommy's favorite child and gets away with murder. But I'm yelled at. Discussing Kiwi Christmas celebrations in 1970, they told of lamb roast, pavlova, and presents. I mentioned adults drinking rum and eating black cake. And I was given black cake yesterday. And I am not going to give that away. I'm going to sit down there and eat it between now and never weary morning. They spoke of beach picnics and were fascinated to imagine our nights, street dancing behind live steel bands and singing carols on the steps of St. George's Cathedral. When I related my story of outwitting a man who tried to steal my bicycle, the children matched with stories of putting one over an adversary. Mrs. Williams, what was the hardest thing for you about writing? Children inquire. The challenge. I had to write in a language, English, which was quite different from the Creolese which I spoke at home. But I like challenges. The ways of thinking are far different, so I had to hop between two ways of viewing the world, a black way and a white way. The answer I will give now is for you, my adult audience of listeners or readers. I never said this to the children. Writing in English evoked contradictory emotions. The process was in part creative, yet it was heart-piercingly destructive because in English culture, the color black is used mostly negatively. The black dog of despair, the black cloud of depression, death, evil, disease, filth, treachery, the black witch, superstition, the black attired villain in plays or in ballets. Black is for ignorance, injustice, slavery, backwardness, coarse conduct, for many things like blackmail, black looks, your black heart, being a blackguard, going over to the dark side. I was in a dark place, film noir, comedy noir. I am black and proud of it. How do I deal with that? I wrote a seemingly childlike story of 500 words about my brother, pushing silver foil far up his nose when he was a toddler. And it's a true story. He found it impossible to blow it out. Deemed a medical problem by the community, Mum felt obliged to obey the British colonial authorities who had outlawed our black citizens' healing practices. Mum took him to the White Run Hospital. Surgery was planned for removing the foil, but this was over my mother's heated objection. However, on the morning of the surgery, an old black female friend sprinkled some black pepper on my brother's nose. He sneezed out the paper. The surgery was rendered unnecessary. My memory of that incident was saturated with anti-British vitriol. I remembered how every aspect of our black lives was denigrated by the colonial powers, our non-white religion. Hospital treatment, education, business participation, our ability to vote, our holding professional jobs, our promotion, political leadership, pensions, whether we should secure bank loans, or our publishing books telling our history from our perspective. If we were defiant, defiance was punishable by imprisonment or hanging. Thus, I found that my writer's voice had first to be drained of venom and must have morphed into a healthy expression of my thoughts, enough to earn a story, a space in the school journals. And until that happened, until I had no more venom, I resisted writing those stories. Reading was equally difficult because I had to block out my emotions or I would have developed self-hatred. Yet I wished to understand the humanity of those writers with different skin hues, different cultures, different opinions, different symbolism and philosophies. When facing a predominantly white audience, it was instantly clear that most of the teachers and children were stumped by initially needing to make sense of a black person. Helping them to be comfortable with and knowledgeable about blackness took precedence over beginning a story or little that I might have said would have registered. And I need to tell you a little story. I once went down to Gore East, and during the day I told the story, but they didn't have money to pay me, and I said, fine. So I said, look, can I have an evening just for the parents? And if they want to throw money in the hat afterwards, fine. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. So I had a charity performance, and afterwards, a mother came and said, Mrs. Williams, do you use your hands when you tell stories? And I said, well, I don't know. She said, my daughter came home, and she was telling me the story. And she said, Mrs. Williams has been in the country 16 years, and it is beginning to wash off. Few school audiences understood that Africa is not a country. It consists of more than 50 quite different countries, that black former slave colonies had been separated from Africa sometimes for more than a century, and that black individuals in Europe, Britain, and the Caribbean, and the three Americas had contributed enormously to modern civilizations. I observed looks of surprise when I explained that traffic lights in their present form are the invention of African-American Garrett Morgan. And you can go right up to the top of Norway and right down to Stanley in the Falklands and right around the world, and you will find traffic lights, a black invention. I tell secondary school students of black Nobel Prize winners, like the Peace Prize given to Kofi Annan, and in literature, like Derek Walcott, the West Indian, for poetry, and Toni Morrison, the American, for novel. I regale them with stories of inventors, like Dr. Charles Drew, the father of blood banks, whose method of storing and transporting blood plasma made possible blood banks, and also made possible improved complex operations like cesarean sections and heart transplants. And that method of storing blood plasma was adopted by the American Red Cross, and those methods have saved millions of lives since World War II. I tell of Otis, O-T-I-S, the black engineer who made elevators safe. So the next time you're in an elevator and you're pressing the button, if you ever see O-T-I-S, that is the safety mechanism that will save your life. And of George Washington Carver, the black American agricultural scientist who invented 300 uses for the pig food called gooba beans. Today, gooba beans have been renamed, and they're called peanuts. What of the black American President Barack Obama? Similarly, who knew of Benjamin Banneker, the black American whose drawing laid out America's capital city, Washington, D.C., and who's ever heard of Alexander Pushkin, one of the greatest literary figures in Russian literature, and his grandfather was black? Who's ever heard of Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers, black grandfather? Listeners knew nothing of an African university and library at Timbuktu in Mali at the time Britain had its Middle Ages. Nor did they know of Clarice Phelps, the first African-American nuclear chemist, a woman, who contributed a synthetic element to the periodic table. Fortunately, they knew of Michael Jordan, Serena Williams, Venus Williams, and sometimes Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson, all Wimbledon winners, and Michael Jackson and Pele, Will Smith, Muhammad Ali, billionaire Oprah Winfrey, and civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King. And sometimes they know of jazz, but usually they know of rap music. Ha ha. By exchanging stories with audiences, I earned my place of belonging in New Zealand society. Storytelling performances convey debates no less complex than those expressed in written texts. Storytelling does demand rigorous analysis, emotional authenticity, intellectual complexity, beauty, and joy. With oratory, stories are more accessible than when you have to look at a squiggle on a page and decipher that first. While a published story is permanently set in its vocabulary, storytelling comes to life differently with every performance. in the length of the dramatic pauses, or in the volume of responsive laughter, in the changing of the teller's tones, the characters singing, the choreography, the energy of the delivery, even the mistakes. I have performed my most popular story, The Black Rugby Shorts, over 200 times, but never twice in the same manner. In the 1980s, children spoke of the Chronicles of Narnia, or of Alice in Wonderland, or of Pamela Allen, but gradually more and more of Margaret Mahy, Joy Cowley, Maurice G., Elsie Locke, Gavin Bishop, Tessa Duda, and Linley Dodd. When reading The Hobbit gave way to the excitement of The Whale Rider, I knew children had turned a reading corner. Then Kiri Hume burst onto the scene by winning the Booker Prize with the Bone People, and Loris Edmond won the Commonwealth Poetry Prize. I witnessed the expansion of libraries' summer programs, book festivals, and film versions of original adolescent novels like Tessa Duda's Alex and Maurice G.'s Under the Mountain and Joy Cowley's The Silent One. Teaching in intermediate school in 1979 and at high school from 1981 to 86 inclusively, my classes enjoyed the privilege of the New Zealand Book Council's visit by Honne Tufare. They appeared starstruck when he discussed Rain and No Ordinary Sun, and that one was about the atomic bomb being dropped. Remembering Honne's impact, in the 1990s at Palmerston North Teachers College, later known as Palmerston North College of Education, I persuaded the principal to fund the children's novelist William Taylor. The following year, the poet Vivian Joseph became the writer-in-residence. The teacher trainees' greater enthusiasm for stimulating writing and reading in the classroom, their enthusiasm justified that experiment. When asked by audiences to discuss the books that influenced my childhood, I hid from children the fact that during slavery, which ended, but didn't, in 1834, and in the early years after emancipation, teaching black people to read, even to read the Bible, was illegal. The white plantocracy theorized that slaves would justly be rebellious if they read of the Exodus and God freeing Hebrews from Egyptian bondage, let my people go, or that slaves would revolt against the normalized everyday rapes of children and of using the strongest slave men to breed the strongest slave women exactly like animals. Whipping slaves with more than 40 lashes and disregarding days of rest were forbidden in the Bible. Moreover, slaves might read of God's punishment of Miriam for objecting to the skin color of Moses' wife. In Numbers chapter 14, we read of that, and she was turned white for objecting to her sister-in-law being black. Read it. Further, the Anglican Church, to please the slave owners, produced the severely truncated Slave's Bible, a literary monstrosity which had eliminated every single reference to liberation and redemption. The plantation owners made it impossible for black people to acquire an unedited version of the King James Bible. Ominously, an act suppressing native religions made it illegal for slaves and later their emancipated descendants to practice any religion other than Christianity. I attended an Anglican girls' high school for 7 years, yet hid from everyone that my family is Jewish. My family prized learning, reading, and memorizing God's book, which held our 5,000-year history. We spoke carefully in retelling horror stories of Guyanese rebellions, hangings, torture, and fearfully practiced silent survival under British rule. These were not things to tell Pakeha Kiwis who disbelieved that the British were brutal rulers of their empire on which the sun never set, as brutal as many other imperial rulers had been. Instead, I told the audience of reading everything I got my hands on: newspapers, Wonder Woman comics, Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies, and British Girls Annual, about upper crust girls riding horses that had to be pulled out of an English bog. I understood little of stories set in countries and cultures of which I knew nothing. I read our family's treasured Bible, but that happened in the 50s and 60s. My great-grandmother Adriana, the illegal farmer and ostensible washerwoman, she loved my reading and histrionic English accent, which I had acquired at my elitist British high school for girls. Adriana insisted that I memorize Psalm 91, the 10 Commandments, and Ecclesiastes 12. The 10 Commandments must never begin, she said, with "thou shalt know," not a "thou shalt not." The Lord spake all these words, saying, "I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And Ecclesiastes, "Oh, remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." What a liar. I imagined myself as the Bible's heroine, Deborah, the prophetess and the army general of Israel. I was intrigued by King David dancing enthusiastically before the ark, and by Samuel hearing God calling to him in his sleep. I knew pride and devastation, hearing dangerously anti-British secret stories of our Demerara slave rebellion of 1823. That massacre of hundreds of slaves haunted me. 10 leaders were tortured, hanged, and beheaded, and had their heads mounted on spikes as a warning. Tales of other slave uprisings singed my soul: the Berbice Rebellion, the ones in Essequibo, the ones in Jamaica, the ones in Dominica. For the success of my international storytelling career, from the 80s onward, I read and memorized Norse legends of snow, clan rivalry, rune writing, and sailing in longboats, and Irish heroic tales of Finn McCool, or of Switzerland's William Tell. They all touched me deeply, and then I curated 20 authentic Kiwi experiences and crafted them into stories. As my storytelling reputation grew, so did the invitations, I'm coming to the end, to perform in Australia, Scotland, England, Holland, Israel, Hawaii, Norfolk Island, Tasmania, Irian Jaya, Canada, the Solomon Islands, and other countries. Invitations arrived from the Red Cross, yacht clubs, Auckland Teachers Training College, the TAFE in Canberra, the A&P fairs in Waipukurau, and kindergarten conferences. And only then did it dawn on me that I was being treated consistently as an honored guest at every venue. This had evolved unobtrusively because I had been operating under the auspices of the New Zealand Book Council. Its imprimatur guaranteed that I would receive the dignity my people had hoped for from the day I was born in the black section of Mackenzie Hospital. Who could have foreseen that in giving storytelling, I would receive a profound sense of identity and purpose in my adopted homeland? As a descendant of slavery survivors, words prove wholly inadequate in thanking the New Zealand Book Council, now Read New Zealand Te Pou Muramura, for this priceless gift of living with dignity in my black skin. Wonderful memories piled as high and mountainous as our Kawarau Range surface. Messrs. Williams, what do you think of New Zealand? I'll tell you, but how much time have you got? So, the only way I could do this is to ask as many of you to rise when I mention a particular group. First of all, I wonder, is Rabbi Joellen here? Please rise, Rabbi Joellen. Rabbi Joellen would give up Tuesdays any time and over a pot of tea would sit down and would read with me ethical books about Jewish law. And there is another rabbi, and this is Rabbi Dr. Oxford trained Esther Jalowski. Would Rabbi Jalowski please stand? Thank you, Rabbi Esther. There are two words that would describe exactly what you do, which has come down from the generations for 5,000 years. You teach Torah. I cannot thank you enough. Please sit. And now, they're members of the Jewish community right throughout the audience, and they have embraced me and made me who I am. I could not stand here and be Mona Williams, the person who hides her Jewishness, because that then is the one thing that is never attacked. I've kept it intact, and it has sustained me precisely because nobody believes I'm Jewish. Would members of the Jewish community please stand so I can thank you? Come on, there you are, there you are. Have a look. Thank you. Please sit. Now there's some dancers. Carito, the copper coats. Carito, please stand. And do I have Dr. Tanya Kapitka? Is she in the room or is she in the overflow? Hi, Tanya. Thank you. Their dancing allowed me to share my Caribbean dance. And in Shura, would you stand? So dance is a big part of me, and you just represent a few of the dancers. Thank you very much. There are storytellers and members of the theater, and I have Tony and Moira here. Any other storytellers, please stand, please do stand up. The storytellers. And of course, I remember Dream Weaver, the first president of the New Zealand Storytellers Guild. There are writers, and of all of them, I'd like to thank my first publisher, Anne Mallinson, and yes, and I'll ask Anne, please, could you stand? And Tessa Duda, who's next to her. And all the writers, please, writers, up you get. My colleagues, because I've taught for 47 years, so I know that there'll be writers and there'll be members of the teaching fraternity of whom I would like to say thanks. And there's also somebody, I don't know if he's sitting here or if he's in the other group, but you know there are some people who tell you little about little? This person so prizes confidentiality, he tells you nothing of anything. Matthijs Silgi. There he is. There's Matt. Hi. Hey, Matt, come on down. Come on. You will get nothing out of him. But Matthijs was the one whose writing allowed me to challenge the New Zealand government, and out of it came a personal apology after 51 years. Matthijs, thank you. Thank you very much. And he tells you nothing. And finally, I have my family, my long-suffering family. And I tell you, if it weren't for my family, I don't think I would have lived. Because there were days when I went to the dark places. The black dog of despair. And because I had children to live for, I decided to live. So my children have given me my life. You have given to me the will to live and you've given me 7 mokopuna, and I have here 4 of them. Could my children and my grandchildren please stand up? Thank you. May I now say thanks, and I'm going to thank, first of all, the New Zealand Book Council, Read New Zealand, Te Pū Muramura. You have gone into so many schools that over 50 years, this is 50 years of the writers in schools, you have touched hundreds of thousands of children's lives. And the readers that we have among you, and the literacy that you have given a boost to that you will never be able to comprehend. I would like to call on Willow. And Willow, would you stand here? And I would like to call on a schoolgirl, and her name is Zoe Geddy, and she is a student at St. Mark's School in Basin Reserve in Wellington. So Zoe, I'd like you to give this. It's very heavy. And you have a little speech to make to Willow, if you can find where Willow is. Thank you, Zozo. The only thing is you have to get this back because it's from the florist. It's very heavy, yes. And this has been so well organized because there's so many people working backstage with the music and everything else. And at the forefront is our true cheval de travail, a workhorse, and her name is Juliet Blythe. Juliet, please come. Allow me to present this to you for all the hard work, and I'll have to get back the pottery jar. So, Mrs. Williams, tell us a story out of your mouth from the moment that schoolgirl's invitation was sent to me. Storytelling and reading have danced together. So now, for the joy of community, for the gift of diversity, and for the vision of harmony, I give thanks. Thank you.